Hello history hooligans, it's me, Michael, the Red Light Historian, and I'm finally back with a long form video for you all. I apologize it took so long, I kinda got lost in the world of shorts, but at least I'm not alone. In fact, in the 1500s, England lost something. The Roanoke Colony. Let's learn something new about something that's old. So for starters, this video might end up being two parts. I'm not entirely sure yet. I'm gonna kind of play it by ear. There's definitely two different sections to the story of Roanoke, and I'm not sure if it would make more sense to put them together or to separate them. So I'm gonna kind of see at the end of this video if it makes sense to put them together or not, and kind of go from there. Secondly, I would like this video to be a bit more personable, so I'm gonna try to tell the story a little bit differently than I normally tell stories, or I've normally done my long form content. If you like it, leave a thumbs up. If you dislike it, feel free to leave a thumbs down, and let's just get into it. During the late 1500s, an English man by the name of Sir Walter Raleigh really wanted to set up a trading post in the New World. Raleigh's scheme was to have the people that lived there look for a passage to the Pacific, find precious metals, and help Christianize the Native Americans. To accomplish these goals, Sir Raleigh needed the perfect location. He settled on a spot near the Chesapeake, which at the time was known as Virginia. Today we know this area as the Outer Banks, and they're connected to North Carolina. They're home to rich forests and has pretty easy access to the sea. However, what really gave this spot its value was its distance from the Gulf Stream. This was incredibly important as the Gulf Stream essentially acts as a highway across the Atlantic, connecting Europe to America. As Spanish cargo vessels crossed the Atlantic via the Gulf Stream, they would come en route directly in front of North Carolina, leaving them easy pickings for the colonists to harass and steal from. Which is why having a colony so close to the Gulf Stream was incredibly important, because this gave you pretty easy access to Spanish vessels that were loaded with gold and silver from the New World as they made their way home to Spain. You see, at this point in time, one of the bigger problems with colonies is that your investment was almost entirely speculative. However, you know what wasn't speculative? Pirating.
Speculative pirating.
Wish I didn't have to burp that entire time. So to help ensure his return on investment, as well as place other investors' minds at ease, he baked privateering directly into the colony. In 1584, Raleigh managed to get the necessary financial backing, colonists, and supplies to set his plan in motion. On April 27, 1584, after receiving a charter from Queen Elizabeth of the Tudor dynasty, the colonists officially left England and arrived at the Outer Banks on July 13th of the same year. This first attempt at establishing a colony on Roanoke went entirely wrong. Somehow they managed to piss off all the locals, and the only people that would help them were two diplomats from the nearby Croatan tribe. Before the year was up, the colonists had decided to call it quits and return back to England. The two diplomats at the time, who were known as Montayo and Wanchese, decided to return with them. Once back in London, Montayo and Wanchese started learning more about the English. During their time there, they studied the English language and even had the chance to meet Queen Elizabeth. Raleigh himself made the decision to name the new territory he recently tried to colonize Virginia. The name Virginia actually came from Queen Elizabeth, who was known as a Virgin Queen. On January 6, 1585, Raleigh was officially knighted and given the title of Lord and Governor of Virginia. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh decided to once again start a brand new colony at Roanoke. During this time, he did start to contemplate colonizing Ireland, but he still held out hope that he could possibly make a buck in Virginia. This led him to make the decision to ask his cousin, Sir Richard Grenville, to command his new expedition to Roanoke. The idea for this second colony was pretty similar to the first one, but bigger. However, they almost immediately ran into problems during transit when a giant storm came and hit their ships. Of the 7 ships that originally left England, only 5 of them made it to the New World. In hopes of trying to resolve some of this, they for some reason decided to pull over in Puerto Rico and do some ship repair as well as just take account of their supplies, and there they started to lose a few of their resources. During this time, the man who was meant to govern this new colony, Ralph Lane, had many complaints. He thought they were spending way too much time in Puerto Rico and eating up way too many resources that they were going to need for winter. The expeditionary force finally left Puerto Rico and made its way to Roanoke. However, of the 500 men that were there, only 100 could stay because of the lack of resources. Grenville took the remaining 500 men back to England in hopes of getting a resupply to take back to Roanoke. Of the people who stayed, 2 men were pretty important: John White and Thomas Harriot. These 2 men spent most of their time mapping out the region, which we now know as Virginia Pars. This map was actually pretty sophisticated and relatively accurate. It also had a lot of good notes on where the local tribes were at that time. As winter approached, Grenville was nowhere in sight, and resources were starting to spread thin. On top of this, the colonists had managed to piss off just about every Native American in the entire area, which was a pretty big deal since that's who they were relying on for help. With all this in mind, Ralph decided to pull the plug on the mission and get the colonists back to Great Britain. This is a little ironic since, in September of 1858, Ralph had written that Roanoke was the goodliest soil under the cope of heaven. This to me sounds an awful lot like cope. As things began starting to look bleak for the colonists, a man named Sir Francis Drake happened to sail by. Drake had recently finished his own expedition in the West Indies, plundering Spanish vessels and settlements. He also found a way into the Pacific Ocean, which was a pretty big deal at the time. Around June 18, 1856, Francis and the colonists returned back to England on Francis's ship. Raleigh was pretty upset at this outcome, but there wasn't a whole lot he could say about the matter since he kinda caused it. As I said earlier, Grenville was supposed to show up with supplies, but he was actually running late. That's because he had been helping his cousin out in Ireland, helping colonize Munster. When Grenville finally did arrive in Roanoke, everyone was gone. Which I guess is technically the first time the colonists of Roanoke disappeared, at least for Grenville. Grenville made the decision to return back to Great Britain, but he did leave behind a 15-man crew to guard the fort, along with a year's worth of supplies for them. In 1587, Raleigh was beginning to dip his fingers into Ireland and was showing disinterest in the New World. Despite this, Raleigh decided to give it one more go and sent a colony back to Roanoke in July of 1857. In all fairness to Raleigh, he did try to switch things up a little bit. Instead of sending soldiers, he sent families to help settle the colony. He also didn't intend for them to stay at Roanoke. He wanted them to go further into the Chesapeake. It was actually the ship captain, Simon Fernandez, who told them to get out, saying that it was too late in the year for them to keep going up the river. This was realistically the first issue that the colony had. The second issue was George Howe. Remember how I said the previous colony managed to piss off all the Native Americans in the area? Well, what I meant to say was that they kinda killed a Sacotan chieftain. In retaliation, they decided to spring an ambush against George Howe, who was a settler for this third colonization attempt. Once word of the attack began to spread amongst the colonists, the governor, John White, decided to lead a counteroffensive against the Sacotan people. However, this is where things start to get a little murky, because John actually never attacked the Sacotan people. Instead, he mistakenly attacked the Croatoan people. After figuring out that he made a huge mistake, John did manage to smooth things over a little bit with the Croatan people, but things were still a little rocky. However, in August, they finally got their first bit of good news. Virginia Dare, the first Brit to be born in America, was born. Virginia Dare's father was Ananias Dare, who was a bricklayer from London. Her mother was Eleanor Dare, one of the 17 women to cross the Atlantic, and her grandfather was actually John White. I also believe another colonist named Marjorie Harvey also had a child, but I didn't see a whole lot of information on them. As August wore on, it became ever more clear that the colony was probably not going to survive winter. They were running low on resources and were pretty prone to attack from Native Americans as well. It was decided that John White would return to England seeking men and supplies to help the colony survive. It was decided that the colony would break into two groups. The first group would remain at Roanoke waiting for John White's return, while the second group would head further inland looking for a permanent settlement. By chance, if the group that chose to stay behind also had to leave, they were to carve their destination into a tree. Additionally, if the group was leaving under duress, they were to also carve a cross into the trees as well. To help ensure everything went according to plan, John White left behind 7 assistants in order to take care of the colony in his absence. As Virginia Dare turned 9 days old, her grandfather John White officially left Roanoke for England. John's trip back to England isn't exactly what you would call smooth sailing. During transit, they ended up running into a pretty rough storm and also lost several barrels of water. This extended time at sea, as well as a lack of water, ended up resulting in several members of the crew getting pretty sick and 2 men actually dying. The vessel carrying John ended up having to dock in Ireland on October 18th of 1857. In fact, he would end up having to wait 1 more month before being able to return to London. Speaking from my own experience in Michigan, by November, it's starting to get cold, if not already snowing. If there's snow on the ground and they don't have access to food, those colonists were probably screwed. Just saying. Immediately upon arrival, White sought out Raleigh in hopes of getting help and supplies for the colonists. Raleigh agreed and, after 4 months, managed to find the necessary supplies as well as 6 ships to help White get back home. Home being the colony. However, both fate and Spain had a completely different plan in mind for White and Raleigh. As word of the impending Spanish Armada made its way throughout England, the crown quickly took control of any vessel capable of battle. Because of this fact, of the 6 ships that were meant to take White back to the New World, only 2 remained. Despite this setback, White decided to continue the plan and began making his way back to Roanoke. The only setback to this plan were that the 2 ships John was relying on to get back to Roanoke were pirate ships. And pirate they did. That was, until they came across the French. Unfortunately for John White, before he had a chance to make it very far in his journey, he was attacked by French pirates, forcing himself to return to England. Unfortunately for White, due to French pirates, the Spanish Armada, and Raleigh's growing interest in Ireland, it would take him nearly 3 years to get home. On August 15th, 1590, a second pirate ship finally allowed White to be able to make it back across the Atlantic. At this time, the pirates had only agreed to taxi White across the Atlantic. They themselves wanted to get back on their journey. They were already a bit antsy, as they lost one of their ships to a storm while crossing the Atlantic. Upon reaching the Outer Banks, John White believed that he saw a signal fire coming from the colony. It took another 3 days, but on August 18th, White did eventually reach Roanoke. This was quite a coincidence, as it was also Virginia Dare's 3rd birthday. However, when White arrived, it was anything but a celebration. When John White returned to Roanoke, it was completely devoid of life. There were no signs of a single living person anywhere nearby. There were no tools, there was no cookware, there were no bodies. Even some of the buildings that they had constructed were completely dismantled. One of the few things John did find that was in disarray was actually a box that he had buried before he left for the resupply. The box had contained a few trinkets that he left behind, but at this point, they were all spread out on the ground of the colony. Despite this, the colony was actually pretty well organized. It looked like the colonists had just up and disappeared. Close to the colony, there was a tree with the letters CRO carved into it. The word Croatan was also carved into one of the posts that made up the wall of the colony. However, neither of these carvings had a cross next to them. This suggested that the colonists may have gone to the Croatan tribe, but they did not leave under any sort of duress. At that point in time, the Croatan tribe lived on the Cape of Hatteras, which was about 50 miles away from Roanoke. John desperately wanted to search for the lost colonies, including his family, but unfortunately he was unable to. There was a terrible storm once again blowing into the area, and the privateers that took John there really wanted to get back to what they were doing. After a brief hunt, John had no choice but to give up. He joined the privateers as they went to the West Indies and then eventually back to England. Not much is known about John from there. Many suspect that he probably died in Ireland around 1606, which was 1 year before the Jamestown colony took off. Speaking of, the people of Jamestown did know about Roanoke. In fact, Captain John Smith had gone out looking for them on several occasions. Interestingly enough, some of the reports made by John Smith, in comparison to the original Roanoke colonists, would suggest that there were actually fewer Native Americans in the area than there were previously. Other colonists of Jamestown reported seeing Native Americans with blonde hair and blue eyes. If this evidence is correct, it would suggest that the people of Roanoke not only managed to move in, but also reproduce with some of the Native Americans in the area. But it appears that they may have spread disease to the local inhabitants and severely dwindled their numbers. Others have suggested, such as English historian David Beers Quinn, that the colonists did manage to move near one of the local Native American tribes, but that Chief Powhatan probably had them killed. Since then, there have been other discoveries related to Roanoke, such as the Dare Stones in 1937, but we're not entirely sure if they're real or not. There have been other archaeological discoveries as well, which would suggest that the colonists did in fact intermix with some of the Native Americans, but we're not entirely certain what all of those mean. You see, archaeological dig sites are actually kind of like your clothes hamper. If you put clothes into your hamper on Monday, by the time Friday comes, there's a decent layer on top of those clothes. The farther down you go, the earlier in the week you get. The same principle applies to dig sites. Over time, artifacts will get buried in layers. The deeper down you dig, the older the artifact is. If you pull an artifact from a certain layer, you know what general era that artifact is coming from. So how does any of this relate to Roanoke? Well, artifacts from the 1500s are being found in layers from the 1600s. So what does any of that mean? Well, to be honest, we're not entirely certain. It could mean anything. The author Scott Dawson, who is a native to the Outer Banks, believes that these findings would suggest that the colonists did in fact move in and begin living with the local Native Americans. However, this isn't necessarily true. These findings could just as easily suggest that the two groups had trade between one another, which, in all honesty, just further lends itself to the mystery surrounding Roanoke. Honestly, I doubt we'll ever find out what happened to the lost colonists. If I had to make a guess, I think they probably all died. As I said earlier, once it hits November in this area, it gets cold. And if you're cold, hungry, and without resources, bad things tend to happen. Just look at the Donner Party. It is possible a few of them did try to move in with the local Native Americans, but I honestly don't see that going particularly well. The colonists were loaded with diseases that were unknown to the New World and probably wreaked havoc amongst the local Native American populations. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if Chief Powhatan did kill the colonists for this exact reason, especially without any sort of working understanding of germ theory. I mean, just put yourself in their shoes. A group of strangers comes up to your door and asks for your help. You say yes, but before you know it, your own friends and family just start randomly dying for weird reasons you may not have ever seen before. If I had to guess, you'd probably get rid of those strangers pretty quickly. I'm not saying you kill them, but you probably make sure they leave your house. Granted, forcing people to survive the harsh New England winter is essentially killing them anyways, so maybe putting them to death was actually the kinder solution. And that's not to say that Chief Powhatan immediately killed the colonists either. It is quite possible that the colonists did have the chance to be able to mate with some of the Native Americans in the area as well. Although using the rumors spread by the colonists of Jamestown is also a little speculative as well, since they had a different idea of race than we do. For example, Ben Franklin himself believed that the Germans, Swedes, and French were swarthy. Essentially, he thought that anybody who wasn't English wasn't white. Additionally, Dr. Susan Greenbaum, an anthropologist and professor at the University of South Florida, had performed research on the racialization of Native Americans and found an extreme lack of consensus. Dr. Greenbaum looked at how the Moa Choctaw of Alabama were racially viewed from the years 1896 to 1902 by looking at poll tax information from that time. She found that 62% of the Moa Choctaw were listed as both white and black during that 6-year period. This just demonstrates that America has never really had a clear understanding of what race really even is. So to try to analyze the words of the Jamestown colonists who were essentially saying they were seeing white passing Native Americans is pretty difficult. Anyways, what I'm basically trying to say is that we have no idea what happened to these colonists, and honestly, we probably never will. There are a lot of hypotheses as to what may have happened to them, but none of them are perfect. Unfortunately for Roanoke, it appears their story will forever remain a mystery. Anyways, I hope you guys all really enjoyed today's video. I know it's been so long since I put out a long form, and I'm hoping to keep doing this. And I also hope you guys are all looking forward to part 2 of this video. There was actually another attempt at establishing a colony on Roanoke that I would like to talk about, as well as the lasting legacy of Virginia Dare. Anyways, I would just like to once again thank you guys all for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all in part 2. And the rest was history.